I'm Lisa Robbin Young, and welcome to this behind-the-scenes episode of The Influencers. In our lead-up to our next show, the one where we figure out what Elvis, a peanut vendor, and the Martin Luther King of music have in common, we're exploring the roots of Latin American music, and the wall I hit when I tried to do too much research beyond the last 120 years. It's pretty easy to track most of the popular music of the 20th century in the United States because we've got a wealth of musicologists, journalists, and historians who've been tracking and preserving that information over the years. Plus, we've got the internet to help fill in the gaps. That's how I was able to track down Shane the Dr. Faber when I was researching Lizzo. But when I wanted to know where the Latin American grooves we dance to now got here, it was a little more challenging. It was hard to find sources that could give me a clear path back to the origins of Afro-Caribbean music or other music from Latin America. Music that I knew was tied, at least in some ways, to indigenous and even slave peoples that had been brought to the Americas. Then, I got lucky. Because here on the campus of Indiana University, we've got the Jacobs School of Music and Dr. Javier Leon. He's an ethnomusicologist that's consulted with the Music Instrument Museum, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Smithsonian Institution. He's also the director of the Latin American Music Center here at IU. He agreed to open his office to me for a one-on-one interview. Field trip! We talked a bit about a few different aspects of this important music history, as well as some important artists of the early 20th century. But the most important thing to me was his explanation of why it's so hard to know how these indigenous instruments were originally used, what they may have actually sounded like, and why all that remains in many cases are ghosts of the past. Join me in this fascinating conversation.
So I'm by trade an ethnomusicologist, so I studied ethnomusicology at the University of Texas. My specialty when I was a practicing ethnomusicologist was kind of like Latin America and especially African diaspora in Latin America, popular music, a little bit dealing with nationalism in different places. I'm originally from Peru, so a lot of the research I did was predominantly based in Peru with Afro-Caribbean music and Criollo music and other stuff like that. After I graduated, I had my first teaching job was at Tulane University. I was there for a few years. And then I came here to be on faculty at the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. I was there for a few years, and then eventually the directorship for the Latin American Music Center opened up at the School of Music, and so I kind of did transition here, and I've been here ever since.
Been here ever since. So what was it that led you to ethnomusicology in the first place?
I've always had musical tendencies since I was little, but there were like no musicians anywhere in my family. So even though I dabbled a little bit with, like my middle school in Peru had the beginning, so what was going to be like a marching band program. So I actually kind of learned to play a little bit of bugle there. But then when we moved to the United States, like right before I started high school, my high school had kind of like a beginning band program. And so I kind of started there. And for the longest time, I just wanted to be a musician. And started out as a trumpet player, play other kinds of brass instruments, a little bit of saxophone. And so that was the thing, but, being the oldest of a family of first-generation immigrants in the United States and being good at math, I was supposed to study, according to my family, engineering or some other kind of science. So I went to undergrad at the University of California, Berkeley, studying astrophysics, while getting a minor in music. But yeah, through all of that, I was mainly performing. I was playing a lot of jazz, also playing a lot of classical music. And then in the middle of all of that, I kind of came across a class at the jazz program there, which was kind of associated with the student group rather than with the music department. They had these kind of like after-hour courses and different things. So they taught, there was like a steel pan band. And for a while, there was this kind of Afro-Cuban group. And so I kind of joined that group and started playing, and began to realize that a lot of the music that group plays, stuff that I was always doing kind of in the background from when I was growing up, and kind of got more interested in it. I also had other friends in the jazz bands who were kind of in this moment that I think most college students get, where you just want to know more about other kinds of music that you didn't grow up around. And so me and 2 or 3 of my friends every semester would take one kind of class about some music from some place that we didn't know anything about, just because we thought it was cool to be exposed to other kinds of music. I ended up in music and culture from Indonesia. And I really liked the professor. And so the next semester he taught a course on music in the Middle East. And so I took that. And then the next semester he was on leave, but the professor who came to replace him on leave was, who was a visiting professor for the year, she was a specialist in the Caribbean. And while I was taking a class with her, I kind of saying, you know, more than performing, more than composition or things like that, this is kind of what I'm liking, right? And the fact that she was doing kind of field work, she would go to the Caribbean and study music and kind of talk about it. That kind of appealed to me. A lot of the music that Peru is kind of largely known for, kind of like the highland mestizo music, which is not from where I'm from, the city Lima and the coast. There's all sorts of other different kinds of music, Afro-Caribbean music, yo-yo music, and waltzes and things like that. And I began to see that nobody was writing about any of those things. So I said, okay, well, that might be an interesting career. And but I still wasn't sure how exactly, as somebody who's getting a degree in astrophysics, you're going to do that. And so I kind of started talking, and there were a couple of graduate students in that class, and one of them had gotten an engineering degree, but then he had transferred to study music, and now he was getting a PhD in ethnomusicology. So I started talking to him, and he's like, oh yeah, you can totally do the transition. And so yeah, more and more I say, okay, yeah, the transition is possible. So I went to talk to the professor who was teaching this class in Caribbean music. Turns out that she had been a math major and had done the same kind of transition. So she kind of held my hand and she said, okay, well, tell me what you want to do. We kind of talked about it. I ended up choosing the University of Texas program.
You said Afro-Caribbean. For those of us not in the know, what is that? What kind of music is that? Can you explain that to us?
Well, I mean, it's just an umbrella term for very different kinds of music, right? It's mostly kind of refers to music that in one way or another has a connection, is part of the African diaspora and has kind of connections to West Africa, although not exclusively to West Africa or to other places. But it's a lot of the music that you find in different parts of the Caribbean, right? Whether it's the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, so kind of like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, or the French Caribbean, Haiti and the Lesser Antilles, places, or even the English-speaking Caribbean, right? Jamaica and Barbados and Bahamas and so forth. And so all of those places are places that have these kind of African roots because of the history of the slave trade in the region. And all of those islands over time have kind of cross-pollinated with one another, despite the, we kind of tend to think of them as separate because of the separate languages that people speak in each island. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of those languages kind of switch and cross back and forth quite a bit over 3.5 centuries. Worth of colonial rule there, and a lot of those islands, in fact, even change hands, right? So,
sure.
So like Trinidad is an English-speaking island, Trinidad is a Spanish colony, and there are several kind of cases of that, and so that leads to a very kind of complicated history, which is kind of why the umbrella term exists, because it's a way of acknowledging that there's kind of like not only a common root back in Africa, but that is also kind of, these are all musics that are historically interrelated to one another in different ways.
Okay, so just so that my brain can parse this, we've got music that's coming across the seas from Africa, and presumably there was music in the islands, in Central and Latin America before that music came. Yes. And then the colonizers came and they brought their music too, and we've now got this melting pot of all these different styles and sounds to create something new. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to West Africa first. Let's go to those origins and those sounds, sure. and then we can talk about how they got here.
Okay. It is hard to tell. So one of the things that people kind of tend to forget about this particular history is how long that history took place, right? It's several centuries. And that makes things, and that history makes things a lot more complex than people kind of tend to assume. Sometimes we look at, for example, some Afro-Cuban religious music, like Regla de Ocha, for example, and you look at the kind of counterpart to that tradition, which is candomblé in Brazil. So these are both musical traditions that develop in Cuba and Brazil, kind of in parallel to one another, out of groups of people who came largely from West Africa, mainly from Ghana. They were Yoruba speakers, who kind of came into both of those places at roughly the same time. And then those musics kind of began to continue. And so people who have done that kind of research can trace, there are songs, there are particular rhythms, there are particular deities that people kind of use the music to pray to, that all those three places have in common, West Africa, Brazil, and Cuba. In some cases, the names of the deities are very similar, although over time they've changed a little bit. And so that tends to create the impression that African music, therefore, there's an inherent quality of African music that has led to it not having changed much over time. That if we were to look at African music 3 centuries back or 4 centuries back, it would probably more or less sound the same as the kind of African music that you find today in West Africa. And that's not true. That music has kind of changed a lot. The reason why you find all of those similarities and connections between those parts of West Africa and Cuba and Ghana is because that was kind of like the very last wave of communities that came. And there were communities that came intact, right? So in many cases, this was a little bit after the end of the official end of the slave trade, when some of the colonial powers, lingering colonial powers, at that point a lot of those islands were becoming independent countries already, we're kind of devising new alternatives for how to basically maintain that labor force. And so there was this kind of complicated system of indentured servanthood that oftentimes doesn't get discussed as much. But one of the things that makes that system a little bit different is that it allowed for entire communities and families to kind of transplant themselves from one place to the other. And that leads to a lot more continuity, right? When entire communities can kind of move themselves, their practices remain kind of intact.
Sure.
And yeah, over time, this has been a century and a half since then. Those practices will become rooted locally, and in the process of becoming rooted locally, they will change and become these own things. They will pick up influences from other things that are happening musically nearby, other kinds of music, other musicians. And so, but you can still trace a lot of the kind of basic elements underneath it. But that is only kind of a surface level thing. The way the slave trade worked, and I'm not an expert on this, but just kind of in general terms, people came from different parts of West Africa at different points. Right. They spoke different languages, they had different religious beliefs, and so sometimes we fall prey to the idea of Africa being one big African country and that it had basically everything in common, and that's not the case, right? I mean, if we were to think of, Africa is a much larger continent than Europe, let's say, but we would never think of, Swedish and Spanish migrants who moved to the same country over time being the same thing, right? Very different kind of musical traditions, even though they have some common basis in between them, right? Spanish music and Swedish folk music, you might see some similar string instruments. Basic chords and ways of using music in Western ways are very different, but Spanish music sounds totally different than Swedish folk music, right? So there are large differences. So that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about African influences. Because when we point at African influences, the things that we kind of tend to think of are those big, broad concepts, right? There are special cases, again, like the Santeria Candomblé example, where you can point to specific songs and rhythms and things like that, but in most, 95% of the time, that's not what you have, right? When you talk about African diaspora music in Latin America, you're talking about very broad things, right? The idea of what people refer to as having a timeline instrument, right? That's an instrument that acts like a metronome, but instead of playing a steady beat, da, 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 we'll usually play an irregular pattern, right? And that all the other percussion parts and melody parts and other things interrelate and interlock with that timeline instrument in different ways. A very basic way in which people in West Africa, broadly speaking, kind of make music. And so you can find that feature of how to make music all over the Caribbean, all over parts of mainland Latin America as well, where there has been African influences. But it's not something that you can point that it belongs to this particular people from this particular place. It's like saying major and minor chords. It's the same kind of generic or broad-based cultural feature, right? So we have that. Broadly speaking, timeline instruments, another way of structuring music, what oftentimes gets referred to as call and response singing, that is very common in West Africa, although there are some similar musical structures in Western music. So like verse and refrain is a sort of call and response, not quite. But so what some people kind of theorize is part of the reason why you begin to get a synthesis of all of these musics in the Americas and not just in the Caribbean is because people are encountering this music, and in the process of you trying to figure out a new kind of music, you're trying to think about analogs or things that are similar to what you know. And in the cases where you can kind of adapt that analog, it makes it a little bit easier for something to kind of stick and turn into something else, right?
We were talking earlier about giving handlebars to something to make it easier to hold on to and understand. Yeah. So, cool.
Yeah, right, but there's also a lot of things that people kind of tend to forget, right? There's also kind of a broad stereotype that, European or Western music is known for harmony and melody, which then that means that African music is known for rhythm. And yes, there are many very sophisticated ways of thinking about rhythm and ways of using rhythm to kind of structure music that come from different parts of Africa, but that's not unique to Africa, right? I mean, India has some, or Indonesia, or there are other kinds of ways of thinking and structuring and subdividing rhythm. But it's been a little bit of a stereotype, right? They kind of, what we kind of think of as the apex of music has always been melody and harmony as kind of Western hallmarks, rhythm as a kind of a support thing. And that has also led to kind of reinforce this idea that African music therefore is kind of unchanging, right? And the other thing that gets lost about that is that there are melodic things. There's ways of improvising, for example. Those are rooted in West African practices, in some cases North African practices that kind of found their way to the Americas through various routes. There are string instruments. Africa has a rich history of string instruments, of vocal music, and a lot of that oftentimes gets forgotten because there's usually a European analog. But because European has less of a sophisticated set of rhythmic related concepts and ideas and instruments and things of that sort, then that becomes the one thing that Africa becomes kind of known for, right? And to a certain degree also applies to indigenous people, right? So when people talk about like the indigenous roots of Latin American music, it's going to be also rhythm, and the other one's going to be ritual, right? Because it's the idea that, again, ritual. Music and ritual are an important thing in a lot of indigenous communities from Alaska all the way down to
Sure.
southern Patagonia, but that's not the only thing that people do, right? But that's the thing that is most unusual in comparison to how we play music, and so that's the part that kind of sticks. And I think an important thing about kind of beginning to think about what does kind of music in the Americas, whether in the United States or the Caribbean or other parts of Latin America is about, is becoming cognizant of the fact that a lot of these cultural influences are very complicated, very complex. So if you look at African influences in the Caribbean, you have layers, you have centuries, generations upon generations over centuries of layers of people from different places. And whereas in places like Cuba and Brazil, a little bit in Haiti, you can point to specific regions of Africa because of certain instruments, because of ways in which you play things, because of cultural or religious ideas associated with that music or terms that people use. In a lot of other parts of America, that is much more difficult. Peru, where I'm from, I mean, you can find all the broad-based African elements in Afro-Peruvian music, but you'd be hard-pressed to find this little element here and this little element there, because the history in Peru was very different. In Peru, descendants of Africans were forcibly brought to Peru, oftentimes from different parts of the colonies. And in mainland Latin America, the strategy for population control was very different. The idea was to try to get people to assimilate as quickly as possible rather than the kind of more segregationist strategy that the U.S. and parts of the English Caribbean kind of followed, and so that leads to mixed set of musical cultural practices that you can still broadly associate with being West African, but where you can't put your finger and say that comes from here or that comes from there or that comes from there, and they get further inextricably mixed with European music or indigenous music, because in a lot of these social situations and contexts in which this music was originally played 2-3 centuries ago, oftentimes you would have a mixed group of people playing, or you would have musicians who are learning how to play somebody else's music, right? If you look at historical chronicles in Peru from the 17th century, you find out that most of the kind of orchestras that play for like kind of high society ballroom dances and stuff like that were hired people of color, usually descendants of Africans, and there were entire bands of musicians that who that became kind of like an industry, right, for them how to learn to play that European music for the upper classes, right? And so over time that also begins to have an influence, right, because you have people of African descent who are conversant in other kinds of music, but who are also learning how to play European music, and who over time become very good at doing both of those things, and over time kind of figuring out innovative ways of kind of putting those things together, right, and kind of mixing them in both ways.
Cool. All right, so then let's look at the indigenous music, because that's something I know nothing about. Just give us the broad strokes, but don't be afraid to go deep on stuff that I would know nothing about.
Well, I mean, indigenous music is in the Caribbean specifically is really hard. The indigenous populations in the Caribbean, for the most part, not completely by any means, but for the most part, disappeared very quickly in the beginning part of the colonial period, within probably 50 to 80 years.
So were they like wiped out by the colonizers, or did they just move? Or
it was probably a combination of all of those things. Part of it was just warfare and kind of antagonistic contact. Part of it is like the famous thing that Columbus and other Europeans kind of brought diseases that people didn't have any immunity for, and that in some cases were very strategically used as a way of kind of control or cut down a particular population. But in other cases, people were just pushed out and they moved to other places, right? And people who lived in the various Caribbean islands were not exclusive to those islands. In many cases, some of those peoples had connections to the Caribbean coast of Central America and even North and South America, places like Venezuela, for example. All of those have kind of common cultures, but for the most part in the Caribbean, we have very little knowledge of what that music sounded like, right? In the late 1400s, early 1500s, you have recordings. Right. The very little that we know are descriptions, usually by missionaries or some other traveler who is hearing something. And this is a person from Europe who's hearing something completely strange, and to them will sound completely strange. So to what degree that's a reliable account of what we're hearing, we don't know. You know, you always have to kind of tentatively. So the main kind of musical religious practice that we know about for the Caribbean, and there's something that it was practiced in multiple islands, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, probably some of their neighboring islands. It was a religious ritual known as the areito. We know that there were different kinds of rattles and flutes and drums kind of using these instruments. We don't know what that music sounds like at all. You know, we have some descriptions of what the ritual looked like and that people played the things, but then you get subjective descriptions like, you know, somebody was playing a very, you know, very enthusiastic melody, or, you know, that's how, you know, this Spanish missionary was reading that. Was that what is actually being meant? So because a lot of that population disappeared, we don't have many clues musically. We can't point to songs or rhythms or things of that sort. But what we do have are instruments. Some of the instruments that to this day we kind of tend to assume are African instruments are in fact not. So maracas, there's one back there somewhere. Guidos, the kind of gourd scraper with all the lines. Both of those instruments, which are kind of if you look at a salsa band, if you look at a reggae band, if you look at any kind of contemporary popular music, Afro-Caribbean band, you're going to see those instruments there next to the congas and the bongos and other similar instruments. You find those instruments throughout northern South America. People assume, because they're usually next to congas or bongos or some other similar instrument that we do know in fact came from West Africa, that these are also West African instruments. In fact, no, they're indigenous instruments that somehow managed to remain, and that people continue to build them and perform them. Now, can you use that instrument to go back and reconstruct what an arito sounded like? Absolutely not. I mean, we have no idea, right? I mean, it's very basic. What you can do with a maraca now is not necessarily what people did with a maraca back then. And so that's where it gets a little bit trickier. There are also kind of trickier connections, right? So in most of Central America, you have a huge variety of marimbas. And in many parts of Central America, especially kind of in Guatemala and Honduras, there's indigenous communities that have been playing those marimbas for centuries. And as such, they're considered to be indigenous instruments, especially because oftentimes people who are descendants of Africans don't play those instruments. But indigenous people do. Mayas play. There's all sorts of Maya marimba repertoire that goes back a couple of centuries. But if you look at the style of construction, that's a West African style of construction. So that is most likely an instrument that was originally introduced when African slaves were brought into the area, and that for various historical circumstances and reasons, descendants of Africans themselves stopped playing, but that indigenous people kind of adopted and started playing, just like people of African descent took instruments like the huiro and the maraca and kind of added them to the kind of music that they did.
So we've got this melting pot of these different sounds, and then we've got these colonizers bringing their music. Talk about what was coming into that area from Europe at the time, musically.
Well, I mean, you have all sorts of different kinds of music. I mean, you had kind of like the upper class. Different kinds of ballroom dancing and the kind of different styles of music that were used to accompany those. And those styles of music are difficult to trace because there was a lot of cross-pollination, not only with the actual aristocracy in Europe, but with actually the musical practices, right? So there's a lot of 3/4 waltz-like dances that kind of flourish as part of that kind of ballroom dancing scene, and they all have different steps and slightly different things, but they're all the kind of the product of these kinds of cross-pollinations of things, right?
For example?
For example, there's a dance in Spain known as the jota, which sometimes a sub-style of it gets associated with the region of Aragon, Jota Aragonesa. It's one of these three, but Jota seems to be, and it's unclear in which direction the influence went, but there is a dance, a ballroom dance that came from Scotland, oftentimes referred to as the Scottish, which is also referred to as the Schottish. So there you see these kind of transformations of Scottish, Schottish, Jota, all these are, so at times I think early, back in the 1940s and 50s, people would try to use that to kind of trace where did something come from. I think it's very difficult to do that. I think it's evidence that there was definitely a lot of cross-pollinating going on there. But what exactly these dances, but Peruvian waltzes at the turn of the 20th century, which is kind of like a working class music. Among them, people play, you only play waltzes, you play polkas. Well, polkas technically are from Poland, right? But polkas became kind of well known throughout this kind of European ballroom dancing scene for a couple of centuries, right? Yeah, so you have these kind of different versions of waltzes themselves, right? There's French and Spanish and German, Viennese variants of it that kind of existed. So you have all of those upper class ballroom dances that are being played. The aristocracy in mainland America and the Caribbean too, for the most part, are people who don't want to be musicians. I mean, they play music, some of them, but they want to go dance. So
they want to be entertained.
Right. Yeah. So you hire people to learn this music, right? So that means that people of African descent or indigenous descent, depending on where you are, are having to learn how to play this music, and that becomes kind of like a trade for them. And that kind of facilitates some of the kind of cross-pollination of these things. You have instruments, different kinds of instruments. There's a little too much speculation to say for sure, but there seems to be in the historical record there were no string instruments, possibly with the exception of some kind of musical bow in South America, prior to European contact. And so, broadly speaking, you can say that string instruments, guitar, violins, harps, kind of show up in the Americas as a result of Spanish contact, right? In fact, violins and harps show up. You have folk music throughout the Americas, from Mexico all the way down, that have some sort of violin and harp combination. Why? Because some of the first musical interventions that the Spanish did in the Americas were in missions. And those missionaries were teaching people how to play harp and violin, which eventually people figure out how to use for all other types of music. But that seems to be that's the reason why Paraguayan harp traditions in Paraguay have at least a passing similarity to son jarocho in Mexico. The other similarities too, because people to this day listen to each other's music, right? So sure. if you hear somebody in Mexico playing Pájaro Campana, which is a very famous Paraguayan harp song, and it's kind of a showpiece because you have to do all these kind of crazy stuff with harp. That is not evidence that they have this ancient common root. That's the fact that somebody who plays harp in Mexico found out that there's Paraguayan harp musicians, and they found a record. He goes, I really like that song. I'm going to learn it, and you start kind of playing it, right? So,
sure.
So part of the other way of kind of figuring out how to trace these origins sometimes was also remembering that these are not cultural contacts that happen once at some point in time immemorial, and that those kind of contacts have continued to kind of move back and forth, and sometimes they get reinforced or rediscovered or in different ways, and oftentimes the contact goes in the opposite direction. Right. There are musics that developed in the Americas and then migrated to Europe. The habanera, which was kind of a variation of a ballroom dance, that kind of developing not just in Cuba but in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, but it's named after Cuba specifically, became kind of all the rage in Spain, right? I mean, to the point that then Bizet is using it for his opera Carmen, right?
Right. Yeah.
And which is kind of odd because it's an opera about bullfighters, yet you're using this kind of thing that is basically an Afro-Cuban song, so or a ballroom dance that is inspired by Afro-Cuban music rather, and so yeah, you have all of these kind of other ways in which these connections kind of happen. Habaneras also became incredibly influential in all over the Americas, right? So if you listen to New Orleans jazz, bum, 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 which is kind of the baseline for a lot of New Orleans jazz and especially brass bands to these days. If you go to New Orleans, that ba, 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 that's basically an habanera rhythm, right? But it shows up in tango in Argentina too, not because tango in Argentina has it does have African influences, but that connection is not because Cuba and Argentina have the same ancient West African root. No, it's because this Cuban dance became popular in Argentina in the 19th century, probably early 19th century, and then it went to influence all sorts of musical forms in Argentina, right? And then people in Argentina listen to that and they hear. So a lot of the cross-pollination you hear in the Caribbean, Latin America, why? Is because people recognize some similarities. And those similarities are there because there has been kind of previous kind of cultural contact or exchange before, and that kind of helps reinforce a lot of that.
So this whole area is really just a hub of activity for all kinds of music and musicians to get to lots of different parts of the world, because in my research, that particular style of music was one of the things that kind of led to Latin jazz in the United States. Mm-hmm. How do we get the music from Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, into the United States in this jazz form that we see so predominantly in early 20th century New York, for example?
Right. So, I mean, most people will look at Latin jazz because the label Latin jazz starts being used in like 1930s, 40s.
Yeah.
really 40s, but people point to some of the stuff that was happening in the 30s as a kind of a precursor to it. We tend to kind of think of that being the kind of catalyst point, right? In many ways it is. 1930s is a moment where the U.S. and Cuba are developing really kind of close relationships. At the same time, the U.S. is doing this with Puerto Rico too, although in a slightly different way.
Right.
Cuba remains an independent country, whereas Puerto Rico becomes a territory of the United States. But it's the consequence of the same thing, right? Puerto Rico and Cuba, up to 1898, were still Spanish colonies, and as a result of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. basically lays claim to both countries, and then for various specificities of each place, they end up, having these two different kind of paths. But in many ways, Cuba and Puerto Rico are two countries that have very parallel histories, with a lot of similarities about them. And so in the 1930s, you have that a lot of Cuban musicians are beginning to be able to travel to New York, and it's going the other way too. Cuba in the 1930s is becoming, in the 1940s later on, is becoming kind of like a resort destination for a lot of the New York upper class. All of these casinos show up in Havana, and American tourists who are going there, they want to listen to the music that people are playing in New York, which is big band jazz. And so there's a demand for big band jazz in Cuba, and there's local musicians in Cuba who are kind of wanting to play that music. But where are you going to learn how to play that music? Well, might as well go to the U.S. and learn it from musicians in New York. So you're beginning to get then this kind of trade that is happening with Cuban musicians who are traveling to New York to learn how to play big bands. And in the 30s and 40s, you begin to see all these Cuban musicians, percussionists, trombone players, saxophone players, who are kind of coming to play with various people, with Duke Ellington, for example, or Cap Calloway, or Count Basie, and so that cross-pollination begins there, and eventually that leads to some Cuban musicians becoming very influential in the New York scene, right? Most famously, Dizzy Gillespie collaborating with Machito and all that kind of Afro-Cuban jazz, and then Machito kind of on his own, kind of starting his own kind of big bandified version of Cuban music that he kind of begins to do, right? But there were other things too, right? Cuban bands were also traveling and touring New York just as American bands were touring Cuba. So you have people like Don Espiazu, who was actually from Spain, but who had a kind of like a swing dance band, and some of his music becomes very popular in Cuba. And those are the beginnings of what we kind of begin to think of as Latin jazz. At the same time that this is happening, since 1917, when Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship in the United States, you also have a lot of Puerto Ricans living in New York because they are now citizens and they begin to relocate to the island. So that means, and being an island that has had a very parallel history with Cuba, and it's nearby, so a lot of Puerto Ricans know a lot of Cuban music and vice versa. So that means that a lot of these Cubans who are coming to New York are realizing that there's other Spanish speakers in these bands, mainly Puerto Ricans who have been there since the teens. And that also begins to influence. That's why by the time you get to Mambo in the 1950s, which is a kind of a more explicitly Cuban set of musical influences within kind of the language of big band jazz, two of the three, the people who are referred to as the big three, right? The three Mambo guys. One was Machito, he was from Cuba. The other two were Tito Puente and Tito Rodriguez, both of whom were Puerto Rican. And their bands were mixed, right? There were Cubans, there were Puerto Ricans, there were African Americans, there were actually a number of Jewish and Italian players in those bands as well. And that was kind of the demographic of the people who kind of played and danced to this music in those years. So that's kind of where the label kind of Latin jazz begins to. But it's important to remember that, I mean, Latin jazz or Latin music really is a label that kind of develops at the time, and it develops from the perspective of the United States, trying to come up with an umbrella term for all of these different kinds of music or these different influences that are kind of taking shape in New York. And not only in New York, I mean, something very similar is happening in Los Angeles, for example, a little bit later, with a lot of this stuff that is coming out of New York and there's coming kind of Cuba is also resonating quite explicitly with Latinos and Mexican Americans, especially in LA, in Texas, in Arizona, and they are also kind of picking up some of this. And there's some earlier historical connections, right? Some of the predating the 1930s and 40s, Cuba and Mexico had a lot of exchange going back to, and you can find musical examples of Afro-Cuban music taking root in Mexico in the Veracruz area as early as the 1870s, 1880s, in the form of boleros and danzones, which are some older kind of musical forms. And Mexico City was also in the 30s, 40s, and 50s a major center of Spanish language film industry and recording industry. So a lot of Cuban musicians would travel to Mexico City to appear in films or to set up clubs or to record albums with local musicians. So there's a whole entire genre of films in Mexico referred to as cabaretera films, or films from the cabaret area, which are all basically Latin jazz mambo films. One of the other big figures of mambo, Perez Prado, was kind of a little bit more of a mainstream artist. He was Cuban, but he was based in Mexico City for a large part of his career, and eventually kind of jumps to LA. So there are all of these other things that are happening in other places, and those are even older connections, right? Because the habanera at the beginning of the 19th century was traveling that entire circuit as well, right? When I was a professor at Tulane and you lived in New Orleans, one of the things that you find out is that up to, I think it was the very end of the 19th or maybe the beginning of the 20th century, you could take a ferry overnight from New Orleans to Havana. And that was another route of interchange. So why do you hear bum, 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 bum in New Orleans jazz? Is because the habanera was also being listened to in New Orleans, because there was a circuit of musicians traveling from Cuba to New Orleans back and forth. And also because people forget that New Orleans started out as a French colony, then became a Spanish colony, then it reverted back to France, and then it was sold to the United States. And I think it was, don't quote me on this, but it was roughly, if not a little bit more, under Spanish hands than it was under French hands. Although we tend to think of New Orleans for just having that kind of French connection, right? But you also have other connections, right? When the slave rebellion that led to the independence of Haiti happened at the end of the 18th century, that led to a lot of French Caribbean upper class Creole people leaving not only Haiti but some of the other neighboring French Caribbean islands. They relocated to New Orleans. So again, there is a long kind of history of connections that goes all the way back. And we don't have enough historical records to go further back than that, but the fact that you find a lot of broad similarities in many different parts of America point to the fact that these are not new things. We tend to think of the internet and music streaming and these kinds of things as the thing that's opened up the world. In many ways it has, because it's made it much easier to kind of access things. But that sometimes creates a false impression that those similar kind of cultural exchanges were not happening before. They have been going on for centuries. Even they go much further back than we can actually document.
Okay, all right. So I talked with somebody else about Cuba and Puerto Rico, and she said that there was quite a musical rivalry around these two different countries when they were coming into New York. Do you have any stories or anything around that?
I think that becomes a little bit of an issue a little bit later on. So in the 1970s, when salsa music kind of emerges out of all of these kind of cultural exchanges, this becomes kind of a very polemical topic, right? Okay. Because salsa music develops in New York by a predominantly Puerto Rican population, although there were other Spanish speakers in there, Dominicans, a few Cubans. And so salsa, rightly so, gets connected very quickly to Puerto Rican identity and Puerto Rican musicians who made salsa what it was. And that is very true. And in fact, salsa had borrowed a lot from other kind of Puerto Rican genres like bomba and plena, aguinaldos, for example. In some of those 70s recordings, you, for example, will see people playing cuatros and other instruments that you don't find in Cuba. And so, yeah, there's definitely a Cuban influence, but some of the underlying baseline music that those musicians in the 70s were adapting was music that had been introduced in New York from Cuba, right? So things like Cuban son and then so on and so forth. Which, again, people in Puerto Rico already knew, so it's not like Cubans just brought. It's a kind of a more complicated history. But it's polemical because, if you look at the broad strokes of the history, the idea is Cubans came in the 1930s. People forget that Puerto Ricans were here already since the teens. But Cubans came in, they brought rumba and son and all of these things that eventually becomes Afro-Cuban jazz. Then in 1959, you have the Cuban Revolution. Right in the middle of the Cold War, the U.S. kind of sets up an embargo, and the influx of Cuban musicians to New York gets cut off. That exchange that happened for 2 decades before all of a sudden stops. And in the process of that happening, that music didn't go away. It was all the people who were still in New York, some of them Cuban, but many Puerto Ricans, many people of other Latin backgrounds, continue to kind of play that music. And by the 1960s and then the 70s, it had become something new at the hands of kind of Puerto Rican musicians, bringing in kind of Puerto Rican influences. But then so that's kind of where the rivalry comes, right? Because some people feel, well, it's originally it's just Cuban music that people are reinterpreting. I think that's not really quite what it is, that you're being a little heavy-handed there. There's a lot of innovation creativity that went on in the hands of Puerto Rican musicians. I mean, even going back to the mambo days, right? I mean, both Titos were phenomenally influential musical influences in the development of that music, and that needs to be kind of acknowledged. And so to dismiss this as, well, you're just playing an updated version of Cuban song is a misnomer. But on the other hand, you can also see how there is this kind of perception, well, when Cuba gets cut off, then other people kind of came in to kind of fill in that void, right? Sure. And I think that part of this polemic also came because later in the 70s and 80s, when connections with Cuba kind of began to open up again, people began to realize that what people were doing musically in Cuba was totally different from the stuff from the 1950s. And so there was a little bit of this kind of attitude from some Cuban musicians who are saying, oh, you guys are just playing the music my grandparents used to play, right? Or you updated that, but we've taken this music. So that's where the kind of rivalry has kind of come from.
All right, so let's talk about some of these artists. You mentioned Machito. Who was that?
Machito, also known as Frank Grillo, was a well-known band leader from Cuba. Him and his brother-in-law Mario Bauzá, a trumpet player, started playing in New York with various different big bands, and slowly he began to figure out ways that there was a market at the time, kind of a market for unusual or different sounding music. Americans wanted to hear what came from the islands. And so Machito kind of begins to kind of capitalize on that. And so Machito and Mario begin to add percussion instruments from different Cuban traditions into a standard jazz big band. Right? So they take timbales, which came from the danzón, they took congas that came from rumba, and then they take bongos that came from Cuban son and the cowbell that goes with it. And they began to add all of those instruments and kind of incorporate and try to figure out how to reuse those instruments in different ways and within this kind of big band context. In a way, Machito had an earlier template, which was Dizzy Gillespie, and I misspoke earlier, it wasn't Dizzy Gillespie and Machito, it was Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo. So Chano Pozo, Cuban percussionist, ended up in Dizzy Gillespie's big band, and they began to kind of experiment. Apparently, it was kind of a difficult collaboration because Dizzy didn't speak any Spanish and Chano spoke no English, so a lot of it was just having to sing things and kind of figure stuff out. And Chano had an untimely death, so that collaboration didn't last very long. But it kind of set up a little bit of an idea of what you could do. If you listen to a lot of some of those Dizzy Gillespie songs, which they're phenomenal, but you can tell that it's still an experimental place. So if like here, like Mantica is kind of like a good example, right? Because it opens kind of, they're doing with horns what you would normally do with like the different percussion instruments in an Afro-Cuban ensemble, right? So each one is playing like a repeated line that gets kind of layered on top of the dum, da 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 da. And then the other instrument comes in, and the other instrument, and that sounds very Afro-Cuban. But then you go into the B section of that song, and all of a sudden it turns into this swing jazz, like da 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 da, and then it goes back, like da 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 da. It's really square, da, 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 and then. And then he swings and then goes back to being square. And so they're still kind of trying to work those out. Those jazz and Afro-Cuban music haven't quite kind of met. What Machito and Mario Balsad do is they actually figure out how to make a more effective synthesis of all of those things. And they do that by using these Afro-Cuban instruments, but developing modified patterns, right? Like conga patterns in rumba, for example, are not compatible with Cuban songs, so you have to come up with new patterns for the conga player to play, right? Same with timbales. I mean, timbales have some connections to the danzón because there's a kind of common habanera. So that was a little bit easier, but they had to invent and create a whole bunch of new things as a way of kind of combining that. So you kind of get that new stuff. Machito is also kind of well known because he would use a lot of old Lukumi songs, the kinds of songs that you would use in kind of Afro-Cuban religious ceremonies. They're actually not in Spanish. They're sang Lukumi, which is a Yoruba ritual language that if you're a practitioner of Regla de Ocho, or people sometimes call Santeria, you would recognize those songs. But you know, most audiences in the U.S. would not know what those songs are. So those were kind of being added there as kind of a nod and winks for those people from the Caribbean who were living in the U.S. who well, I know what that is, right? And but he would do that, but he would do like a very jazzy kind of version of those tunes, and that's kind of what starts. And eventually, that kind of leads to Machito kind of beginning to experiment more with form and creating kind of what eventually becomes mambo, right? And mambo itself becomes a synthesis, so it's what people in New York, like Machito and the two Titos, are doing, but Pedro Prado is doing his own version of that. In Benin More also, in Cuba and in Mexico City. So it's kind of a triangulation of things that are happening in those three cities. A musician is traveling between those three cities that eventually leads to the creation of mambo. And New York becoming one of the main places for it, but not the only place.
Tito Puente.
So, Tito Puente, I mean, Puerto Rican band leader, grew up in New York. His family had moved there when he was young. Tito becomes a particularly important figure because he kind of develops the timbales, right? A lot of the thing, I mean, and Tito would put himself in front of the band, right? So, and he would play timbales. So all of these kind of phenomenal solos and fills that later on become kind of a staple of salsa music, for example. All of those have roots in the kinds of innovations that Tito Puente was doing back in the 50s with his particular band. And you see, if you listen to Tito's band, the kind of things that he was doing are different than the kinds of things that Machito was doing, or that Tito Rodriguez, which was more known for being kind of a crooner and doing kind of this big bandified versions of boleros, was doing at the time. So they all had kind of different flavors of how to do these things, right? And Tito goes on to become a very influential figure for this reason. And beyond just the mambo world, right? So when Carlos Santana becomes a big thing in the 60s, Carlos Santana had been listening to Tito Puente. So here's a guy who grew up in a family of mariachis in Tijuana, and who wanted to listen to jazz because that was like the cool thing that the kids were doing at the time, and his parents harassed him about it. They told him that, you know, he did not have an identity as a Mexican, that why is he listening to all this Cuban music, and you know, but that was like his thing. And so he became after playing in his family's mariachi, he becomes kind of this rock guitarist and musician. But what he grew up listening to, the cool music that a lot of those rockers in the 60s were listening when they were in their early teens, was mambo. Yeah. Because it was Spanish language and because it spoke to them, even though they were not Cuban, right? The same thing was happening in Texas, in Arizona, in LA. And so one of his most famous songs when he kind of comes out there is he basically does a cover of the Tito Puente song, Oye Como Va, that he kind of does in that kind of rock format. And mambo ends up having a lot of influence that people kind of forget. Mambo kind of disappears quickly when rock and roll kind of gets introduced. But a lot of the chord progressions that you hear and a lot of the kind of grooves of those early rock and roll bands are basically taken from all of these mambo bands and these kind of Latin American songs, right? So, I mean, the Beatles themselves were kind of listening to that stuff. So if you listen to Twist and Shout, bum ba 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 bum bum ba da da dun da da dun da 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 dun dun, that's also Richie Valence's La Bamba, right? Which is a Veracruzan, originally a folk song from Veracruz, but you also have a very similar version in Cuba called Guantanamera. They're all the same chord progression. They all have slightly different rhythms, but so there's been a cross-pollination that goes way back that has these kind of Cuban and Mexican roots that people are not necessarily always kind of familiar with, but they're there, right? And what acted as the bridge in many cases was music like mambo that might have started out in kind of this niche between New York and Cuba and Mexico City, but became really popular throughout the Americas, and that kind of gave everybody kind of like a common set of musical tools to kind of interrelate with each other.
Yeah, the thing that brought me to Tito Puente was Jennifer Lopez and Bruno Mars both citing growing up listening to Tito Puente, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to go closer, right? So Tito Puente's goddaughter is Sheila E, right? Phenomenal timbale player. Guess who she learned to play timbale from, right? And she has gone on to become a really important producer, not just a musician. I mean, she kind of worked with Prince, and she did all these things in the kind of early 90s. But today, she's kind of like behind producers, behind precisely all of these artists, like Pharrell Williams and all of these things. So yeah, you can see all of these. Another really cool one is if you talk to break dancers, like the original break dancers from the early 80s up in New York and in the Bronx, and you see some of the moves that they're doing, they look a lot like moves that mambo dancers were using back in the 1950s. And when you see interviews with some of those musicians, a lot of whom were Puerto Rican and who were kind of living in Spanish Harlem and the Bronx, and they were eventually hip-hop kind of emerges, a lot of them goes, the DJs, the music that there were some people were sampling James Brown and George Clinton and things like that we kind of recognize more. But a lot of people, like especially the Spanish-speaking DJs, they were sampling Tito Puente. They were sampling all of these things. And you see interviews with some of these dancers who are saying, oh yeah, my uncle so-and-so used to be a mambo dancer, and so I just kind of stole one of his moves, right? So some of the moves that break dancers do are actually connected to that kind of older history of mambo in New York City too.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, I have another name that may or may not have any connection, but I'm going to drop it anyways. Celia Cruz?
Okay. So Celia Cruz started her career, and by the way, I'm just giving you the broad strokes because I don't remember the specific dates for some of these things. But no, she's famous Cuban singer, had a very successful career early on in her life in Cuba, particularly singing with a group called Sonora Matancera, which was an incredibly influential band throughout the Americas. I mean, Peru, where I'm from, claims to have like the oldest Sonora Matancera fan club everywhere because it got formed in the 30s, I think, or something
wow.
like that. Yeah, and so she kind of became a singer of that long-standing group for many, many years. Was really well known up to the 1950s, and then during the Cuban Revolution, that her career kind of came to an early end of sorts, and she ended up living in New York years later. And then when the salsa boom begins in the late 60s, by the 1970s, the salsa boom is, and that's everything that people, salsa sounds Afro-Caribbean, so people tend to think that salsa originated in the Caribbean. No, it originated in New York first and then spread. So salsa develops in New York, and I think it was Johnny Pacheco, one of the band leaders, a guy from the Dominican Republic, knew that Celia Cruz was living in the city, and kind of invites her to kind of start singing with some of the bands. And so then she kind of has like a completely renewed career in the 70s as kind of the singers of various kind of Fania Records was kind of like the salsa version of Motown in the 1970s. So the most famous is Fania All-Star, which was kind of like a super group with like the best players from all the other records and label. And so Celia Cruz, working with Johnny Pacheco, become kind of like a huge, very iconic of that time period, right? So I mean, there's that famous documentary about the George Foreman Muhammad Ali fight in Africa, Rumble in the Jungle. It's the Fania All-Stars that opened for that band, right? I mean, salsa was huge, and it goes to I forget what they play, Zaire. I think that they play. And they play this huge concert in Zaire, and the people in Zaire are going crazy. Because, again, people are hearing certain similarities, or at least some broad-based similarities in the kind of music that they're playing that they recognize. And again, the easy connection is, ancient root? Well, not so much, right? In the 1960s, Cuba was aiding a lot of independence movements in Africa. And so there were Cuban soldiers and aid workers and different things in different parts of West Africa. So Cuban music was being heard in different parts of Western and Southern and Central Africa in the 1960s. And so by the time, this is in the mid-70s, when Fania gets there was already a little bit of a familiarity with this music. And it leads to an explosion of salsa-like music that develops in different parts of West Africa, which again keeps, when we think of Afropop, we tend to think of the connection of like Fela Kuti and James Brown, which was also a very kind of important connection there. But that was not the only connection that was happening. It was also happening with salsa. It was kind of this very complicated triangulation that is happening there.
I love it. That's great. Okay, we're heading into the home stretch. Okay. Are there any pieces of music that we haven't talked about yet that you think would be good primers or things that might, like, you should really listen to this, or here's a great example of that?
There's so much good stuff there. But I mean, since we've mentioned some mambo pieces, sure. I mean, I would say learning how to contrast the big three and the other bamboo bands, I think that's a good way of doing it, right? So Tito Rodriguez has a whole bunch of, to listen to kind of like the more big band version of a bolero that was kind of, that Tito Rodriguez is, Estoy Como Nunca is probably a really good song. And yeah, Tito Rodriguez, of the three, is probably the one who gets the least credit, but he has had this very smooth and crooner-like voice. I mean, he was almost kind of like Nat King Cole, but he managed to sing that with this giant band behind him. And so Tito Rodriguez becomes very influential too, more in the kind of ballad singing styles, that kind of things like bachata, for example, that we kind of think of, that also have a root to a lot of these kind of music, boleros and to Cuban son and all of these kinds of things. Tito Rodriguez kind of is part of the roots of those things, and oftentimes that he doesn't get addressed as much as Tito Puente or Machito. Sure. So yeah, I would say Tito Rodriguez would probably be a good place to listen to.
All right, I'm going to shift gears back to you. What music are you listening to?
Oh my God! But I don't know. I have two young kids, a daughter 7 and 10. One of them is a Swiftie, so there's always some of that going on in the background. Although my wife has been kind of instilling Joan Jett.
Nice.
in there, and what is some Natalie Merchant and some other things in there. The youngest one, she listens mostly to Disney songs so far.
Sure.
But no, I mean there's a lot of different stuff. I mean, I started out playing jazz, so I'm a big fan of that, and being a trumpet player, I'm a big fan of a lot of that kind of big man mambo kind of sounding.
What do you like about it?
It's just punchy and really dynamic. I mean, I'm a trumpet player. I want to listen to trumpet players doing cool things, right? So anything with a horn section, I'm like totally obsessed with. And you know, mambo is kind of like a good start. I mean, I start out with like regular big band jazz, but then when you kind of begin to hear the stuff, you hear the percussion, people are singing in Spanish, it just kind of resonates in a different way. But no, I mean, a lot of those Motown bands from the 60s and 70s with big horn sections, or even the disco bands that come later, you know, Sly and Family Stone or Earth, Wind and Fire, all of that stuff is just great. As far as I'm concerned, all the Chicago blues stuff too. But yeah, that's just my predilection. And because I'm a horn player, also I also like kind of like a lot of 19th century orchestral music, because there's a lot of heavy brass.
So if you're on a deserted island and you can only take 10 songs with you.
10 songs?
10 songs. What are you going to take with you?
God, that's a really tough one.
It doesn't have to be 10. I'm just like, let's build a short list here.
I mean, yeah, definitely some of the songs that I mentioned would be part of that song list, but then I would draw from very different other places, right? There's a Colombian singer called Totola Momposina. There's a lot of kind of Afro-Colombian folkloric stuff, and her music has changed over time quite a bit. She used to do mainly singing and drum stuff. Now she does like a more kind of popular music stuff with like an added band. Her stuff's phenomenal. My early field work was with a Peruvian singer, Susana Vaca, who's still a very old friend. I would definitely have to take some of his music, or she would be very upset if I didn't, especially because my percussion teacher is her percussionist. Yes. But yeah, no, I mean, in the kind of Peruvian realm, a lot of those criollo waltzes back from the 40s and 50s, there's some phenomenal finger styling stuff that those guitarists do. Oscar Avilés, anything by the Santa Cruz Siglos, Nicomedia Santa Cruz and Victoria Santa Cruz, kind of pioneers of Afro-Peruvian music. More recently, this group of friends of mine, Teatro del Milenio, they do phenomenal stuff. Most of the songs are compositions by these great guitarists, Roberto Arguedas. So yeah, there's Afro-Colombian stuff. Colombian music. There's also this little known genre of Colombian music, broadly referred to as fandangos, which is like dance, folk, brass band music that is just insane and super fun. And I can listen to that stuff all day. So love tangos too, especially the kind of instrumental ones. So yeah, a little bit of everything.
Cool. Awesome. Is there anything you thought we were going to talk about that we didn't mention?
No, I think we did a pretty good job covering.
Okay. All right. Then I think we're done. Thank you for taking all the time to just sit with me and share your wisdom and help my audience get to know this music better.
Well, thanks for having me. This is great.
What an interview. Special thanks to the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University and Dr. Leon for letting us commandeer his office for the afternoon. Think you know who our mystery artist is? Let us know in the comments or visit our website, wfiu.org/theinfluencers. Next time, we'll take a closer look at Latin music in New York in the early 20th century with another special guest interview. Aurora Flores was friends with the late Tito Puente, and she'll help us connect the dots between our mystery artist, a peanut vendor, and the Martin Luther King of music. Until then, I'm Lisa Robbin Young, reminding you that you never know what kind of an impact you make on the world around you. Who influences you?